The arrow took the man beside Levi Hunter clean through the shoulder, and the scream that followed was swallowed by the roar of burning grain. Levi did not look up from the wound in front of him. His hands were slick to the wrist, pressing linen against a gash that ran from hip to rib, and if he lifted his eyes even for a heartbeat, the man beneath him would bleed out before the count of 10. Around him, the night had become a churn of torchlight and screaming horses, the windmills of the Windmere Plateau turning black against a sky lit orange by a burning granary, and somewhere close, far too close, steel was ringing against steel. "Hold him still," Levi barked at the boy crouched across from him, some militia recruit no older than 17 with wide, terrified eyes. "Hold him still or he dies right here in the wheat." That was when the ground shook. He felt it before he understood it, a tremor that rattled the needle in his fingers, and then a shape came crashing through the burning stalks like a landslide given legs. An orc woman, huge and terrible in the firelight, swinging a warhammer that looked as though it had been forged for a giant, and behind her 3 riders were closing fast with spears leveled at her back. Levi had heard the name before, whispered in the tavern with a mixture of dread and grudging awe. Vrogash Earthshaker. He had never seen her. He had never wanted to. But he watched her plant her feet in the loam and swing that hammer in an arc that took a rider clean off his horse, watched her roar something in the guttural tongue of her people that needed no translation, and he understood in the space of one held breath that this was not a monster from a fireside tale. This was a woman fighting for her life, 3 against 1, and losing ground with every step back. A spear caught her in the side. She staggered, and the world seemed to slow. Levi did not remember deciding to move. He remembered only that his hands were suddenly empty of linen and full of the surgeon's satchel he carried everywhere, and that his boots were carrying him toward the fighting instead of away from it, which every soldier who had ever bled beneath his needle would have told him was the single stupidest thing a man could do on a battlefield. "Hunter, get back!" Someone shouted Garrick Voss, the town's guard captain, somewhere in the smoke, but Levi was already skidding to his knees beside the orc woman as she went down hard among the wheat stubble, her hammer falling from a hand gone suddenly nerveless. Up close she was even larger than she had seemed from a distance, all corded muscle beneath leathers cinched tight across a powerful frame, her tusks catching the firelight, her dark eyes finding his with a fury that had nowhere left to go. Blood soaked through the leather at her side, dark and fast, and Levi knew death when he saw its shadow crossing a face. "I am not yours to save, little man," she ground out through her teeth, in accented but perfectly clear common tongue, even as her hand found the hilt of a long knife at her belt and tried, and failed to lift it. "You're not asking me to save you," Levi said, already cutting away leather with the small blade he kept for exactly this purpose, his voice steadier than his hammering heart had any right to be. "I'm doing it whether you like it or not. Lie still." She should have gutted him for the insolence. Later, she would tell him that she had considered it, in the single clear second before the pain and the blood loss dragged her under. Instead, her hand fell away from the knife, and Vrogash Earthshaker, who had never in her adult life allowed a human to lay bare hands upon her, let the world go dark while an apothecary with steady fingers and no fear in his eyes packed her wound with clean cloth and pressed down with the whole weight of his body to slow the bleeding, shouting for men to bring a litter, shouting that this one lived. This one lived, damn them, bring the litter now. Behind them the windmills kept turning, indifferent, while the grain burned. The Windmere Plateau had been disputed ground for longer than Levi had been alive, a wide golden shelf of farmland between the mountains and the river, crowned with a ring of great windmills that had ground grain for 3 generations of the town below. For most of those generations, an uneasy peace had held between the town of Windmere Crossing and the Cragmore clan whose hunting grounds lay just beyond the ridge. The boundary stones that marked the old treaty line had stood unmoved for 40 years. Then 6 months passed. Half of them had been found smashed and scattered, and no one on either side could say for certain who had done it. Since then it had been raid and counter-raid, burned granaries and stolen cattle, militia patrols and clan warbands eyeing each other across fields that both peoples needed to survive the coming winter. The town blamed the orcs. The orcs blamed the town. And somewhere in the middle of it, quietly, patiently, moving the pieces like a man arranging stones on a bored, Reeve Aldrich coil, the grain Reeve who controlled every mill and every granary on the plateau, and who stood to inherit the whole of the disputed land if the treaty broke for good, smiled behind his ledgers and said nothing to discourage the rumors. Levi Hunter had stitched wounds from both sides of that quarrel more times than he cared to count, in the cramped back room of his apothecary shop on Windmill Crossing's main square, where jars of dried yarrow and willow bark lined the shelves and the smell of vinegar and beeswax never quite left the air. He had learned in the war before this one that a wound did not care whose blood filled it, and he had never once turned a bleeding man away for the color of his skin. It had cost him friends. It had cost him, more than once, the goodwill of men who thought a healer ought to choose a side. He had never regretted it. He had simply never expected the wound in question to belong to the most feared war leader the Cragmore clan had produced in a generation. She woke on the third night in the narrow cot at the back of his shop, and Levi, dozing in the chair beside her with a book open and forgotten on his knee, came awake to find her dark eyes already open and fixed on him with an intensity that made the hair on his arms rise. "Where is my hammer?" she said. Not a question. A demand, low and rough with sleep and pain both. "Captain Voss has it under lock in the guardhouse," Levi said carefully, setting the book aside. "Along with your knife, I'm sorry. It was the only way they'd let me bring you here instead of leaving you for the crows." Something flickered across her face, not fear. He would learn later that Vrogash Earthshaker did not know fear the way most people did, but something colder and more careful, calculation. "Then I am a prisoner." "You're a patient," Levi said. "There's a difference if the town lets there be one. I've argued for 3 days that there is." She studied him for a long moment, taking in the dark circles beneath his eyes, the ink and herb stains on his fingers, the plain, unremarkable face of a man who had clearly not slept properly since he dragged her bleeding out of the wheat. "You are the healer," she said finally, "the one who put his hands on me in the field." "Levi Hunter," he said, and did not offer his hand because he had a feeling that would not go over well with an orc who had just woken up in enemy territory with her weapons confiscated. "You're going to live if that's any comfort." The spear missed anything vital by the width of 2 fingers. "You'll ache like the dead for a month, though." "I have ached worse." She shifted, testing the wound, and hissed through her teeth at the pull of new-knit flesh. Then, before he could tell her to lie still, her hand shot out and closed around his wrist with a grip that could have snapped bone, though she did not squeeze hard enough to hurt him, only enough to hold him in place while she looked, really looked into his face. "Why?" she said. "You could have let the wheat take me. No one would have blamed you. Why did a human healer crawl through arrows to save a Cragmore war leader?" Levi held very still, aware of the strength banked in that grip, aware too that she was not truly threatening him. She was asking honestly a question that seemed to matter to her a great deal. "Because you were dying," he said simply. "And I've spent 10 years learning how not to let that happen to people, whoever they are. I didn't ask your name before I knelt down. Didn't seem relevant at the time." Her grip loosened. She did not let go entirely, but her thumb moved once absently over the pulse point of his wrist as though she were memorizing the rhythm of him. "Vrogash," she said. "Vrogash Earthshaker. You will use it since you have earned the right to know it." "Vrogash," Levi repeated, and something in the way he said it, plainly, without fear, without the mockery he'd heard other men put into orc names, made her tusked mouth curve just slightly at one corner. "You are a strange little man, Levi Hunter," she said, and released his wrist at last, though her eyes stayed on him a long while after, as though she had not finished deciding something important. That first night, sleepless in the chair because he did not trust the guard outside not to do something foolish, Levi discovered the thing about her that would come to define every night that followed. Even wounded, even weaponless by the town's decree, Vrogash did not truly sleep the way other patients slept. She dozed in fits, one eye seeming to open at every creak of the floorboards, and when Levi finally convinced her near dawn that she was safe enough to close both eyes for more than a few minutes at a stretch, her hand found the empty air beside her hip where a blade should have rested and closed on nothing, and her whole body went rigid with a wrongness he could see even in the dark. "They took everything," she muttered, more to herself than to him, bitter as ash. "An orc without her blade is an orc already dead. I have not slept unarmed since I was blooded at 14 summers. I'll get it back," Levi said, surprising himself with the certainty in his own voice. "I don't know how yet. But I will." She looked at him as though he had promised to pull down the moon and said nothing at all, but the next time he checked on her, sometime past dawn, she had finally, truly slept, one clawed hand curled loosely near where her hip ached, as though even in unconsciousness she was reaching for something that was not there. It took Levi 4 days, and every scrap of goodwill he had built in Windmere Crossing over a decade of stitching wounds without asking questions. But on the 5th morning, he walked into Garrick Voss's guardhouse and walked out again with a long, wickedly curved knife wrapped in oilcloth under his arm, and the great war hammer left behind only because Voss flatly refused to release a weapon that size to a woman still healing from a spear wound, treaty or no treaty. He brought the knife to her himself, and the look on her face when he set it, unwrapped, into her open palms was one he would remember for the rest of his life, something raw and unguarded passing over features built for war, gone again almost as quickly as it came, replaced by a fierce, private satisfaction as her fingers closed around the worn leather grip. "You went against your own captain for this," she said. "It was not quite a thank you." Orcs, he was coming to understand, rarely spoke in the shapes humans expected. "He owed me a favor. I've pulled 3 arrows out of his men over the years and never once sent him a bill for it." Levi shrugged, trying to make it smaller than it was. "Seemed like a fair trade." That night, for the first time since the wheat field, Vrogash slept with her blade beneath her hand, laid bare across the blanket where anyone could see it, and Levi understood without being told that this was not carelessness. It was a message. She was healing in enemy territory, guarded by a man she had known for less than a week, and she would keep her steel close enough to use it on him in a heartbeat if he ever gave her cause. The blade lay across the space between them like a line drawn in the sand, not because she distrusted him precisely, but because trust, for an orc who had survived as long as she had, was not a gift given lightly, and certainly not before it was earned. Levi found, oddly, that he respected her more for it than he would have if she had simply handed him her safety and expected him to guard it. She was not asking to be protected. She was choosing, moment by moment, whether to let herself be. The weeks that followed the wheat field skirmish were not peaceful ones. Word of the fight had spread through Windmere Crossing like fire through dry stalks, and though Reeve Coyle publicly wrung his hands about the tragedy of it all, privately he made certain that every tavern conversation bent toward outrage that an orc raider, for that was how the story traveled, an orc raider, never mind that she had been ambushed defending her own scouts, now lay recovering under the town's own roof, tended by its own healer, at its own expense. Levi weathered the muttering the way he weathered most things, with his head down and his hands busy. He changed Vrogash's dressings, brewed her willow bark tea for the fever that came and went, and slowly, without quite meaning to, began to look forward to the hours he spent in that back room more than any other part of his day. She was, once the pain eased enough for her to be something other than a wounded animal, sharp-tongued and startlingly funny, with a dry wit that caught him off guard more than once into genuine laughter. She asked him question after question about his work, turning his little vials and jars over in her huge hands with unfeigned curiosity, wanting to know what each herb did and why. until Levi found himself explaining the properties of yarrow and feverfew to a woman who listened as intently as any apprentice he had ever trained. "You could have been a soldier," she told him one evening, watching him grind dried root into powder with a mortar he'd owned since before the last war. "You have a soldier's steady hands. Why do you only mend and never fight?" "I fought," Levi said, without looking up, "long enough to learn I was better at keeping men alive than at killing them. Seemed a more useful skill in the end. The world has enough men who are good at the other thing." Vrogash was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "Among my people," she said slowly, "a healer who has also seen war is honored above almost all others. We call them stonebenders, those who hold a warrior's broken pieces together so she may fight again. It is not a small thing, what you do, Levi Hunter. Do not let this town's small minds convince you otherwise." He looked up at that, startled by the warmth in her rough voice, and found her watching him with an expression he did not yet have a name for, something appraising and something else beneath it, something that made his pulse trip in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "I'll try to remember that," he said, a little unsteadily, and busied himself with the mortar again to hide the color rising in his face, though he did not miss the low, satisfied sound she made in her chest, almost a purr, at having so easily unsettled him. It was 3 weeks after the wheat field, with Vrogash strong enough to walk the length of the shop unaided and growing restless in a way that worried Levi more than her wound ever had, that the border dispute took its next violent turn. A grain barge was burned at the river landing, torched in the night, the loss blamed at once and loudly on Cragmore raiders by men Levi recognized as riding for Reeve Coyle's private guard, though he could prove nothing. 2 nights later, 3 orc hunters were found dead near the ridge line, their throats cut in a manner too clean, too deliberate, for the wild beasts the town coroner tried to blame. The Cragmore clan, hearing of both, gathered their warbands at the treaty line and sent word through the only channel they trusted. They wanted Vrogash Earthshaker returned to them, and they wanted answers, or there would be no more grain harvested on the Windmill Plateau by anyone, human or orc, ever again. "I have to go to them," Vrogash said, standing at the shop's back window with her knife already at her hip where it belonged, watching smoke rise faint and gray on the horizon. "If I do not walk into that camp myself, whole and speaking with my own voice, my chieftain will believe the town has killed me, and then there will be no treaty line left standing by autumn. There will only be war." "Then I'm coming with you," Levi said. She turned, and for once there was no wit in her expression, only a stark, searching seriousness. "You do not understand what you are offering. If I bring a human into that camp, some among my own people will want your blood before you finish drawing breath to greet them. And if a Cragmore war leader walks alone into a town that half believes she murdered 3 of her own hunters to start the very war everyone claims to fear, some among my people will want yours." Levi met her eyes steadily. "Seems to me the only way either of us walks out of this hole, Vrogash, is if we walk in together." She studied him for a long moment, and something in her face, some final wall, seemed to ease just slightly, like a held breath finally released. "You are either the bravest man I have met," she said quietly, "or the greatest fool. I have not yet decided which." "Ask me again after," Levi said, and began packing his satchel. They rode out at dawn, Levi mounted on the placid mare he used for house calls across the plateau, Vrogash walking beside him with the long, unhurried stride of someone who had crossed harder ground than this on foot 100 times before. The grain stood tall and gold on either side of the wagon track, turning silver where the wind combed through it, and above them the windmills of the plateau spun in slow, patient circles, unconcerned with the fragile piece balanced beneath their sails. It was on the second night of that journey, camped in the lee of an old stone watchtower half crumbled from some forgotten war a generation past, that Levi woke in the deep, dreamless hour before dawn to a sensation he could not immediately name, a wrongness or perhaps a rightness that pulled him up out of sleep before his mind had caught up with his body. He lay still a moment, getting his bearings. The fire had burned down to embers. Vrogash slept a few feet away, wrapped in her cloak, her broad back to him, breathing slow, and even in the particular stillness of true rest the first time, he realized with a small jolt that he had ever seen her fully, deeply asleep rather than dozing with one ear cocked to the dark. And there, laid on the ground in the narrow space between them, not across her own body as it had been every single night since the wheat field, not gripped loose but ready in her hand as it had been in his shop, was her knife, resting beside him, not on him. Levi went very still, staring at the long, curved blade glinting faintly in the last light of the coals, understanding with a slow, dawning warmth exactly what he was looking at. For 3 weeks that blade had lain across every space Vrogash occupied like a wall, a warning, a boundary she drew between herself and a world that had given her every reason not to trust it. It had never once pointed toward him with intent, but it had always been there, close enough to use, close enough to remind him, and perhaps to remind herself, of exactly how much distance still remained between an orc war leader and the human healer who tended her wounds. Now it lay simply beside him. Not guarding against him. Guarding, if it was guarding anything at all in that half-open hand, the space around them, both around him too, as though somewhere in the dark of her sleeping mind, she had stopped sorting him into the category of things that needed watching, and started sorting him into the category of things worth keeping safe. Levi did not move for a long time, afraid of breaking whatever fragile, unspoken thing had happened in the dark, while neither of them was watching. He simply lay there, watching the firelight play over the blade and the broad line of her shoulder beyond it, and felt something in his chest crack open that he had kept carefully closed for a very long time, the quiet, aching hope of a man who had spent years being useful to people, without ever once being chosen by them, feeling, for the first time, that he might have just been. When Vrogash woke at first light and found him already awake, watching her with an expression he could not quite hide, she followed his gaze down to the knife lying between them and went very still herself. "I did not put it there to threaten you," she said low, almost defensive, before he could speak. "I know," Levi said softly. "That's not what it looked like at all." She was quiet a long moment, her jaw working, and when she finally spoke her voice had dropped into something rawer than he had heard from her before. "An orc who trusts nothing sleeps with her blade upon her own skin, so that even in dreams her hand knows where death rests and can meet it before her eyes open. I have slept that way since I was a girl of 14 summers, Levi Hunter, through 3 wars and every night of my life since. I did not decide last night to lay it elsewhere. My hand simply did it while I slept without asking my permission." She looked at him then, and there was something almost like fear in it, though not fear of him. Fear, perhaps, of what it meant. "I do not know what to make of that." Levi reached out slowly and closed his fingers gently over hers where they still rested near the blade, not taking it from her, never that, only resting his hand atop hers the way a man might rest his hand over a held breath. "I think," he said carefully, "it means some part of you already decided I wasn't something you needed protecting from, and that maybe you'd rather protect me instead." Vrogash looked down at his hand over hers, at the pale, ordinary fingers laced loosely with her clawed, scarred ones, and when she looked back up at him, whatever war had been fought behind her eyes seemed, for the moment, to have found its resolution. "Perhaps," she said, and this time there was no defensiveness in it at all, only a rough, dawning wonder. "Perhaps it does." They reached the Cragmore war camp by mid-morning, and Levi Hunter, who had spent his whole life being unremarkable in exactly the way that let a man move safely through a hard world, found himself walking into a camp of several hundred armed orcs at the side of their most feared war leader, drawing every eye like a lit torch dropped in dry grass. Vrogash's chieftain, A broad, gray-tusked orc named Magra Ironjaw with more battle scars than Levi could count, met them at the edge of the camp with a face like a closing door, and the conversation that followed, conducted in a rapid mix of common and the Cragmore tongue that Levi could only follow in pieces, was tense enough that his hand never strayed far from his satchel, the only weapon he had ever needed to defend himself with. But Vrogash spoke for a long while, steady and unflinching, gesturing once toward Levi with a hand that did not shake, and whatever she said seemed, slowly, to turn the tide of the chieftain's suspicion. By the time the sun stood at its highest, Magra Ironjaw had agreed, grudgingly, to send her own trackers to investigate the deaths of the 3 hunters before any warband moved against the town, and Levi found himself, astonishingly, offered a bowl of stew by an orc elder who had spent the last hour glaring at him as though deciding where best to bury his bones. "You did well," Vrogash murmured to him that evening, as they sat near the edge of the camp's great fire, watching the flames throw long shadows against the hide tents. "Better than well. My chieftain does not offer food to those she means to kill." "High praise," Levi said dryly, and she laughed a real laugh, warm and unguarded, that turned more than one head around the fire and made his chest ache with a fondness he was rapidly losing any ability to deny. It was there, that night, camped among her own people for the first time since the whole ordeal began, that Vrogash Earthshaker did something Levi would later understand was not casual, was not idle, was in fact one of the oldest and most deliberate gestures her culture possessed. She sat close beside him at the fire, closer than propriety among either of their people strictly allowed, and reached over without a word to take his hand, turning it palm up in her own, tracing one blunt claw slowly along the calluses, their calluses built from years of grinding herbs and gripping needle and thread, not from any weapon. "Among my people," she said quietly, not looking at him, watching the fire instead, "when a warrior wishes to claim another as hers to say, before her clan, 'This one is mine, and I will fight the world to keep him,' she does not ask permission with pretty words the way I am told your people do. She simply begins to act as though it is already true and dares anyone, including the one she has chosen, to say otherwise." Levi's mouth had gone dry. "And is that," he managed, "what you're doing right now?" Vrogash turned to look at him then, firelight catching the sharp planes of her face, the dark intelligence in her eyes and something fiercer beneath it that made his heart slam against his ribs. "I have watched you crawl through arrows for a stranger," she said, low and rough. "I have watched you stand against your own captain for a knife that was not yours to fight for. I have slept beside you for 3 nights running and woken each morning to find you had not once tried to take advantage of a wounded woman's trust, though every soldier I have ever known would have. I do not give my claim lightly, Levi Hunter. I have never given it at all to any man, orc or otherwise, in all my years. But I am giving it to you now if you will have it, and I am not asking prettily, because that is not my way." For a long moment Levi could not speak at all. Then he turned his hand in hers, lacing their fingers properly together, and said the only thing that felt true enough to answer her with. "I've spent 10 years patching up other men's lives and going home alone every night to a shop that smells like vinegar and dried flowers," he said quietly. "I didn't think anyone would ever choose me, Vrogash. Not like this, not so completely." His voice roughened. "So yes, I'll have it. I'll have you if you'll let a man as ordinary as me keep you." "Ordinary?" Vrogash repeated, almost scoffing, and lifted his hand to press it, astonishingly gently, against the side of her face, against the rough plane of her jaw. "There is nothing ordinary about a man who is not afraid of me." And when she kissed him, there beside the fire with half her warband pretending very hard not to watch, it was not gentle at all. It was fierce and hungry and certain. The kiss of a woman who had decided something and would not be argued out of it. And Levi Hunter, apothecary of Windmere Crossing, who had never once in his life expected to be wanted so completely by anyone, let himself be claimed. They returned to Windmere Crossing 4 days later with Magra Ironjoe's tracker's findings in hand, proof, ugly and undeniable, that the 3 dead hunters had been killed by riders wearing Reeve Coil's own livery beneath their cloaks, hired to stoke a war that would clear the plateau of both people's claims and leave the land free for one man's profit. It should have been enough to end the whole quarrel on the spot. It was not enough to stop what happened in the square. Word had reached the town before they did Twisted, as such words always were by the time they traveled through frightened mouths, into a story where the orc war leader had gone to her war camp and returned leading an army, where the healer Levi Hunter had betrayed his own people to an orc's bed, where the burned barge and the dead hunters were somehow, impossibly, both the orc's fault and proof of an invasion yet to come. By the time Levi and Vrogash rode into the market square at midday, the crowd that gathered was not curious. It was afraid, and fear in a crowd of frightened men was a fire that needed only a spark. "There she is!" Someone shouted, and then it was a roar, dozens of voices tangling together, men surging forward from the market stalls with hoes and staves in hand, a woman screaming that the orc had come to finish what she started, an old farmer hurling a rotten turnip that struck Vrogash's shoulder and split against her leather with a wet, ugly sound. "She saved my life in that field," Garrick Voss bellowed, shoving his way through the crowd with 2 of his guardsmen, trying to make a wall of bodies. But the mob was already past listening to reason, already surging around the edges of the square where the great stone well stood, already reaching for anything they could throw or swing. Vrogash's hand went to her hammer. Voss had returned it to her before they'd left for the Cragmore camp, a gesture of trust that suddenly seemed likely to end in blood, and Levi saw, in the single terrible instant before everything might have gone irreversibly wrong, exactly what would happen if she drew that weapon here now, in front of a screaming crowd already primed to believe the worst of her. She would defend herself. She would have every right to. And the story that traveled after would not be about a woman defending her life. It would be about an orc who attacked a town square full of unarmed people, and no truth Levi carried in his satchel would ever catch up to that lie. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He threw himself between her and the crowd. "Stop!" His voice cracked across the square, raw and desperate, and he threw his arms wide, putting his own unarmed body directly in the path of the nearest men, close enough that the farmer with the second turnip had to check his throw or risk hitting the town's own healer instead. "Stop, all of you, before you do something you can't undo. Get out of the way, Hunter, she's dangerous," someone shouted. "She's the reason half of you are alive to shout at me right now," Levi shouted back, and something in the raw fury of his own voice, so unlike his usual quiet steadiness, made the front rank of the crowd hesitate. "I have proof, real proof, not rumor, that Reeve Coil's own riders killed those Cragmore hunters to start this war, and burned that barge themselves to blame the orcs for it. I have the tracker's report in my bag right now. You want to hang someone for what's happened on this plateau, you'd best make sure you're hanging the right person, because I promise you it is not the woman standing behind me." A stone struck him in the shoulder anyway, thrown by someone at the crowd's edge who either had not heard him or did not care, and Levi staggered but did not fall, did not move from where he stood shielding Vrogash's front while she, astonishingly, let herself be shielded by an unarmed man half her size, her hammer still lowered, her jaw tight with a fury Levi could feel radiating off her like heat from a forge. Held in check only by the raw trust she had placed in him days before beside a dying fire. "Levi," she snarled, low and urgent, "move aside, they will hurt you." "Not going anywhere," he said through gritted teeth, blood trickling warm down his shoulder where the stone had caught skin, never taking his eyes off the crowd. "Not today. Not ever if I can help it. You want to get to her, you go through me first, and then you'll have to explain to this whole town why you beat the man who stitched half your children's scraped knees just to get at the woman who saved his life and asked nothing for it." The square went, for one suspended moment, utterly silent. It was Garrick Voss who broke it, shoving finally through to Levi's side with his guardsmen fanning out behind him, sword drawn not against Vrogash but turned outward, toward the crowd. "He's telling the truth," Voss said, loud and hard enough to carry. "I've seen the trackers marks myself on the ride back. Reeve Coyle has been buying this war one dead man at a time to steal the plateau out from under both our peoples, and if any one of you lays another hand on this woman or this healer, you'll answer to me before you answer to her hammer, because God knows which of the two of us you'd rather face." It was not a speech that ended the fear all at once. Fear built over months did not dissolve in a single afternoon. But it was enough. Voss's blade turned the right direction, Levi's blood on the cobblestones, the raw, unmistakable truth in a healer's voice that had never once lied to any of them in 10 years of tending their wounds, enough to make the crowd's rage falter, then fracture, then slowly, shamefully, disperse into muttering knots that could no longer quite meet each other's eyes. Vrogash did not move until the square had all but emptied. Then, and only then, did she reach out and turn Levi bodily around by the shoulder, her huge hands surprisingly, fiercely gentle as she pulled the torn cloth of his shirt aside to examine the bruise already blooming dark beneath his collarbone. "You are a fool," she said, and her voice shook just slightly in a way he had never heard from her before. "A brave, reckless fool who stood between me and a mob with nothing in his hands but words." "Worked, didn't it?" Levi said, trying for lightness and failing as the shock of the last few minutes finally caught up with his knees. "It could have gotten you killed." Vrogash's hands tightened on his shoulders, and when he looked up into her face he saw, beneath the fury, something else entirely, something raw and frightened and fiercely, achingly grateful. "No one has ever put themselves between me and danger, Levi Hunter, in my whole life. I am the one who stands in that place for others always. I did not know what it would feel like to have someone stand there for me instead." "Get used to it," Levi said softly, reaching up to cover one of her hands with his own, ignoring the throb in his shoulder. "Because I'm not planning to stop." That night back in the small room above his apothecary shop where Vrogash had taken to sleeping since their return from the war camp, Levi came awake in the small hours to the low sound of her voice, murmuring something in the Cragmore tongue too soft and rough with feeling for him to follow, and found her sitting up beside him in the dark, watching him sleep with an intensity that might have unsettled him from anyone else. "You are healing slowly," she said, nodding toward the bruise on his shoulder, dark and ugly in the moonlight through the shutters. "It troubles me that I could not stop it happening." "You didn't need to stop it," Levi murmured, still half asleep, reaching for her hand in the dark and finding it easily, as though his body had already learned the shape of where she would be. "That's the whole point of standing beside someone, Vrogash. Sometimes it's your turn to bleed a little so they don't have to." She was quiet a long while after that, turning something over in the dark, and when Levi finally drifted back toward sleep, he did not see her rise, silent as smoke despite her sighs, and lay her knife down on the floor beside the bed rather than beneath her own hand as she had every night of her adult life before this one. He woke at first light to find it there resting beside him on the worn floorboards, its curved blade catching the pale morning light through the shutters, close enough that either of them could have reached it in an instant, but positioned unmistakably on his side of the bed rather than hers. Not across him, not near her own hip, ready to defend herself the moment her eyes opened. Beside him, within his reach as much as hers. As though somewhere in the dark hours of the night, watching him sleep with a bruise on his shoulder he'd taken for her sake, Vrogash Earthshaker had made a decision even more final than the one at the war camp fire, that whatever came for either of them from now on, it would have to go through the both of them together, and she would rather her blade guard his rest than her own. Levi lay very still, looking at it, and felt something settle in his chest that he did not think would ever come loose again. "You are staring at my knife instead of at me," Vrogash said dryly from the doorway, already dressed, arms crossed, watching him with poorly hidden amusement despite the exhaustion shadowing her eyes. "I am almost offended. I woke up and it wasn't on you," Levi said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, thick with something he could not quite name. "It's never not been on you, not once since the day I met you." Vrogash's expression softened, the teasing edge falling away into something quieter, more honest. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, picking the blade up herself, turning it once in her hands before setting it deliberately on the small table beside the bed, near enough to reach, but no longer between them at all. "I have carried this blade since I was 14 summers old," she said. "Through every war, every raid, every night I have ever slept beneath any roof or none. I told myself it was because an orc who sleeps unguarded is an orc who dies." That was true for a long time. She looked at him and her voice dropped, rough with an admission that clearly cost her something to make. "But I think, in truth, it was also because I had never once slept beside anyone I trusted enough not to need it. Last night I looked at you, bruised for my sake, sleeping without a single doubt that I would not harm you in the dark, and I understood that I did not need to guard myself from you at all. Only perhaps to guard you a little, the way you have insisted on guarding me." Her mouth curved, wry and tender at once. "You are a stubborn habit to break, Levi Hunter. I find I do not mind breaking for you." Levi reached up and drew her down into a kiss that held all the things he did not yet have words for: gratitude and disbelief, and a fierce, unfamiliar joy at being chosen so completely by a woman who could have had any protector she wanted, and had picked, instead, an ordinary healer with steady hands and no fear of her. They did not rise from that bed for a long while after, and when at last they did, the sun stood high over the windmill plateau, and the windmills turned lazy circles against a sky scrubbed clean of smoke for the first time in weeks. Reeve Aldrich Coyle did not surrender his ambitions quietly. Confronted 3 days later in the town hall with the Cragmore Tracker's findings, laid out plainly before the town council by Garrick Voss, and corroborated by 2 of Coyle's own hired riders who broke under questioning and admitted, white-faced, to killing the hunters and burning the barge on the Reeves' orders, Coyle did not weep or beg or confess. He simply smiled, thin and cold, and said that a man did what was necessary to secure a town's future, and that some among the council would thank him yet, once they saw what a border shared with orcs truly cost a people in the years to come. It was not enough to save him from the council's judgment, stripped of his office, his grain contracts seized, his private guard disbanded on Voss's order, but it was enough, in the days that followed, for him to make one last desperate throw of the dice. He had, it turned out, kept back a dozen of his most loyal riders, unregistered and unaccounted for, and on the night before the treaty renewal was to be signed between Windmere Crossing and the Cragmore clan, a renewal that would, at Vrogash and Levi's urging, finally redraw the boundary lines to share the plateau's water rights fairly between both peoples. Coyle sent those riders against the negotiation camp itself, hoping a massacre blamed on either side would tear the whole fragile peace apart before it could ever be signed. Levi was in the treaty tent, laying out bandages and salves out of long habit even for a meeting he expected to end in nothing bloodier than heated words, when the first torch arced over the palisade and the shouting began. "Riders!" Voss's voice cracking across the camp. Coyle's men, 12 at least, coming in from the ridge road. Vrogash was already moving before the words finished leaving Voss's mouth, hammer in hand, shouting orders to the small honor guard the Cragmore chieftain had brought not to attack, but to form a defensive ring around the tent where the human and orc negotiators alike were scrambling for weapons never meant to be needed at a peace talk. Levi did not think. He grabbed the nearest lantern, dashed its oil across the mouth of the narrow supply tent beside the treaty grounds, and set it alight. A wall of flame springing up bright and sudden between the charging riders and the negotiators' camp, buying precious seconds while Voss's guardsmen scrambled into formation and Vrogash's honor guard closed ranks with them. Human and orc shoulder to shoulder for the first time in living memory, facing a common enemy instead of each other. It was Vrogash who met the lead rider's charge head-on, planting herself in his horse's path with a roar that would have made lesser men flee outright. And when the animal reared rather than trample her, she swung her hammer in a blow that took the rider clean from the saddle before he'd finished screaming. Levi, satchel forgotten, snatched up a fallen guardsman's spear and stood his ground beside her rather than retreat to safety. And when a second rider bore down on them both, it was not Vrogash who moved to intercept. She was already engaged with a third, but Levi himself, planting the spear's butt into the earth and bracing it at an angle that sent the charging horse shying wide at the last instant. Buying Vrogash the half-second she needed to finish her own fight, and turned to cover his flank in return. They fought like that for the space of perhaps 3 frantic minutes, an apothecary who had never in his life meant to be a soldier again, and an orc war leader who had never in her life fought beside someone she was afraid to lose, until Voss's guardsmen and the Cragmore honor guard together broke the last of Coil's riders and sent them fleeing back down the ridge road into the dark, leaving 4 of their own dead in the trampled grass and the rest in chains before dawn. When it was over, Vrogash turned to find Levi still standing, spear in hand, breathing hard but whole, and the sound she made something between a sob and a laugh torn loose from somewhere she rarely let anyone see, undid something in both of them at once. She crossed the space between them in 2 strides and pulled him into her arms hard enough to lift him half off his feet, burying her face against his neck while he clung to her just as fiercely, the 2 of them shaking together in the aftermath of a fight neither had been certain they would walk away from. "You are supposed to run from danger, Levi Hunter," she said into his hair, her voice raw. "Not stand in a spear's path beside me." "You didn't run either," Levi managed, half laughing, half weeping into her shoulder. "Guess that makes us both fools together." "Good fools," Vrogash said fiercely, pulling back just far enough to press her forehead to his, tusks and all, careless of how it must have looked to the guardsmen and clan warriors gathering around the dying fire of the burned supply tent. "The only kind worth being." The treaty was signed the following morning, in the pale gold light of a plateau finally quiet after months of violence, a new boundary line, drawn not through the middle of the grain fields to divide them, but along the ridge where the windmills stood, with water rights and harvest shares split fairly between Windmere Crossing and the Cragmore clan for the first time in either people's memory. Magra Ironjaw signed it with a thumbprint pressed in ink beside her name. Garrick Voss signed for the town council, Reeve Coil's seat left conspicuously, permanently empty. And when it came time, at the treaty grounds' final gathering, for the town to hear from the healer and the war leader whose actions, first in a burning wheat field, then in a screaming square, then in a night of fire and steel at the negotiation camp, had done more than any council vote to hold the fragile peace together, it was Levi Hunter who stepped forward first, in front of the assembled crowd of townsfolk and clan warriors both, and did not let himself hesitate even a moment before he spoke. "Some of you threw stones at this woman 3 weeks ago in the market square," he said, his voice carrying clear and steady across the gathered crowd, Vrogash standing tall and silent at his side, her hand finding his without either of them planning it. "Some of you believed every ugly rumor a greedy man spread because it was easier than believing an orc could be anything other than an enemy. I don't blame you for the fear. I understand it. This plateau has bled both our peoples for longer than any of us have been alive." He drew a breath, and when he continued, his voice did not waver even once. "But I am telling you now in front of everyone, human and Cragmore both, so there is no rumor left to twist and no doubt left standing. Vrogash Earthshaker saved my life the same day I saved hers in that burning field, and she has saved it a dozen times since, in ways some of you watched with your own eyes. I love her. I am not ashamed of it, and I will not hide it, not from this town, not from her clan, not from anyone who thinks an orc and a human have no business choosing each other. She chose me first, out at that war camp fire, when she had every reason in the world to choose no one at all. I am choosing her back now in front of all of you, because I want there to be no question left in anyone's mind about where I stand, or who stands beside me. The square, or what stood for one, out on the treaty grounds beneath the turning windmills, fell utterly silent. Levi felt Vrogash's grip tighten on his hand, hard enough to ache, and when he glanced sideways at her, he found her staring at him with an expression too raw and unguarded for a woman who had spent her whole life being feared rather than adored. It was Magra Ironjaw who broke the silence, to everyone's surprise, letting out a great booming laugh and striking her chest with one fist in what Levi had learned was the Cragmore gesture of respect. "The Stonebender speaks plainly," she called out, loud enough to carry to every corner of the gathering. "Let no one here mistake his meaning twice. My war leader has chosen her mate before her whole clan and this town both. Any who would challenge that choice may challenge me first, and I promise you, I am considerably less patient than she is." A ripple of nervous laughter broke through the crowd, and beneath it slowly something else, a loosening of shoulders, a lowering of old suspicions that had no more fuel to burn on now that the man who had lied to feed them lay disgraced, and the woman he had slandered stood, unmistakably, as one of the reasons the plateau's war had finally ended instead of consumed them all. Garrick Voss stepped forward next, clearing his throat, looking faintly embarrassed but resolute. "For what it's worth," he said, "the town guard owes this woman more than an apology. We owe her the truth, spoken plain. Windmere Crossing would have burned to its foundations by now if not for her hammer and his hands, working together instead of against each other. I'd say that settles any question of whether she belongs among us, and settles it for good." Vrogash turned to Levi then, ignoring the crowd entirely, ignoring the weight of 100 watching eyes, and cupped his face in both huge hands with a tenderness that stole the breath clean out of his lungs. "You did not have to say all of that in front of them," she murmured, low enough that it was almost only for him, though the whole gathering could surely still hear it. "You could have simply loved me quietly, where it was safer. I've spent my whole life being quiet and careful and unremarkable," Levi said, his voice thick. "I stitched wounds and went home alone and never once let myself want something loudly enough that losing it might actually hurt." He covered her hands with his own, holding her gaze. "I'm done being quiet about the one thing in my life I'm not afraid to lose, Vrogash. I want this town to know exactly who I belong to. I want your clan to know it too. I want there to be no corner of this plateau left where anyone can whisper a lie about you that I haven't already stood up in the daylight and called false." Vrogash made a sound low in her throat, somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and kissed him then in front of the whole gathered crowd of townsfolk and clan warriors, tusks and all, careless of who watched, fierce and certain and utterly unashamed. And this time, no stone flew, no voice rose in anger, no torchlit fear turned the moment into something ugly. There was only, slowly, a ragged cheer rising from somewhere in the crowd, taken up by more voices, human and orc both, until the sound of it rolled out across the golden fields and up toward the turning windmills like something finally, fully mended. They built their life together on the plateau itself, in the end, in a low stone cottage set at the treaty line itself. A deliberate choice, Vrogash's idea, though Levi had loved it the moment she suggested it. A house built exactly where the old boundary stones had once stood, belonging fully to neither Windmere Crossing nor the Cragmore clan, and so, in its own quiet way, belonging entirely to both. Levi kept his apothecary shop in town, riding in 3 days out of every 7 to tend the sick and the wounded as he always had. But he added to his skills in those months a new kind of medicine, besides salves and remedies drawn from Cragmore knowledge that Vrogash's clan healers taught him gladly, once they saw how carefully, how respectfully he learned. Vrogash, for her part, took up a role no orc had ever held on the plateau before, a liaison and border warden answering to both town and clan alike, riding the new treaty line to settle disputes before they could ever again curdle into raids and burnings, her hammer resting more often on her back than in her hands, though she never once let herself grow careless enough to leave it behind. And every night, in the small stone cottage between the two worlds she now called equally her own, Vrogash Earthshaker set her blade down on the table beside their bed rather than beneath her own restless hand, not because she had forgotten the wisdom that had kept her alive since she was 14 summers old, but because she had found, at long last, someone whose presence made that old vigilance unnecessary, someone worth resting beside instead of merely guarding herself within reach of. Levi woke most mornings to find her already awake, watching him in the pale light through the shutters with an expression of open, unhidden wonder that he suspected he would never quite grow used to and never wanted to. Some mornings she reached for him first. Some mornings he reached for her. But every morning, without fail, her knife lay quiet and still on the little table by the bed, close enough to snatch up in an instant if the world ever again demanded it of her, and yet never once again laid between them as a wall. It rested beside him, not on him. And in that small, constant, unremarkable fact repeated morning after morning, season after season, long after the border dispute had faded into a story other, younger couples on the plateau told their children about the healer, and the war leader who had ended a war neither of them started. Levi Hunter found the truest measure of how completely, how fiercely, how permanently he had been chosen. He had spent a lifetime being ordinary, overlooked, alone in every way that mattered. And then a woman who feared nothing, who could have had any protector or any peace she wished, had looked at him bleeding through arrows for a stranger and decided, without asking his permission, that he was hers to keep. He had never once regretted letting her.